Hey guys, welcome to the HTML Crash Course. This course is going to cover everything HTML in the current modern times of HTML. So we'll be covering HTML5 as the current standard. So before we begin, I want to just reiterate that this is for absolute beginners. We won't actually use CSS in this course. I know a lot of courses kind of take the whole summarized approach of building websites and use CSS and HTML and some JavaScript, which are languages used to build websites commonly, and kind of compact them together. But I find if you extract some of those things and niche down pretty hard, you kind of understand the underlying features of each language a little bit more before going and diving in. So we're going to be focusing mainly on HTML5 syntax. So that is the way currently that most websites render their code underneath using that HTML5 version. Additionally, this isn't meant to be you take this course and you're just going to be proficient with HTML out of the gate. So you want to just kind of come down to terms with the fact that it's going to take time, a lot of practice and energy to put into understanding what this is. This is almost like learning another language. So if you speak English, maybe you're wanting to learn Spanish or French or something like that, or vice versa, you would need to obviously practice, put in the time, probably many days to just kind of get to that point. A more in-depth course that I'm putting out it is coming soon, and when I launch this video, is called Hello HTML CSS. So in that course, I'll actually combine what will be these separated videos into more comprehensive projects that we'll build together and kind of go around the concept of modern day front-end web development. So by front end, I mean the stuff you see in the browser instead of the stuff under the hood that's doing some logic. So it'll be more focused on both HTML and CSS and how they work really well together and ways you can extend them to make your life a little more easy as you progress with either site builders, no-code tools, or just generate your own websites, whether it's your portfolio. Maybe you're a designer or a developer or something like that, or want to be a developer. What is HTML? Let's start with the very basics of the language. So HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. That language is designed to render data in the browser. So the way it works is these separated tags you get, which look like greater than and less than signs if you're used to math, are responsible for rendering content in the browser. So it's displayed in a certain way that makes it work. HTML is not a programming language, so there won't be any kind of conditional statements or anything like maybe if this happens, do this thing in the browser. That's just for backend technologies. So something like maybe you've heard of PHP or Ruby or something like that runs on a server. It tends to kind of be responsible for that logic that in the end will render HTML in most cases. Any device pretty much that you access the web on is using HTML to render the content that you're viewing. So if you're here, you might be coming with the concept of, I need to learn this for my job or just because I generally want to do more with my skills or just learn more about the internet. You might wonder why you might want to learn HTML. And of course, that big one, I think, is for most is to do more at your job. For my own case, I started out as a designer and I wanted to kind of be more involved in the space to where I have more control of my own website, how it looked, how it functioned, those things. So it just kind of gives you more control. If you learn to code enough, you can actually start to profit from it. So you might earn some side jobs, you can get some freelance jobs or something like that, or even just, create some sort of service maybe down the line as you progress and earn money every month from it. Additionally, there are no-code tools that are kind of coming up around the market. No-code tool is basically a tool that enables you to not code, but use code underneath to create apps or websites. So you can think of it as a modern day designing tool, but it uses code to achieve what it's after. So this essentially allows you to understand those better because underneath the hood, they're using HTML and CSS as well. So if you can kind of speak the lingo and understand what HTML is, you'll understand those a lot more and have less headaches. And, just the whole learning experience of those tools is less taxing. Of course, you want to be able to build your own websites and brand. That's typically the most use case for learning introductory languages like this. I think my first goal was to get out my own personal website when I first learned. So that's just something you might want to do. And then, of course, to have a foundational understanding of the language before moving on to something more advanced. So I think because HTML is the foundational language, you probably want to learn it first before learning more dynamic languages or more advanced stuff that does more of that conditional logic we were talking about before. So tools used to author HTML, typically you just need a browser which actually renders the HTML code. And then underneath, behind the scenes, you create these HTML files. So they have a .html extension, and you can edit those in what's called a text or code editor. And some big names are Sublime Text 3, Visual Studio Code, Atom, and then of course you can choose anything else you want to use. But I suggest something with syntax highlighting, so it's just easier on yourself as you go to actually code. In this video, I'll probably be using Visual Studio Code. It's kind of the most popular code editor at this point in time. Sublime Text is of course there too, and Atom. So you can use anything you want there. Don't be worried if you're not using what I am. Like I said just before, there's a .html extension of the file name. So that's kind of what gives HTML its characterization, and it lets the browser know what to render based on its file name. So if it has that extension, typically you can just throw it in your browser and it'll actually open. And it's pretty neat how it works. You can either double click on the file if you're on your Mac or PC, and it should open in your browser. It might not, depending on some preferences you might have set, but in general, you can drag it into a browser either way and probably have it open. A browser in mind, you can use pretty much anything you prefer. The three big ones I think right now are Chrome, Safari, and Firefox. I believe Microsoft has their Edge browser that's out there too you can use. I failed to put that in the slide, but that is another one. Most of those run on the same technology that Chrome uses, so you won't have too many big differences between all of them. Firefox kind of rolls its own thing, and actually I prefer Firefox personally, but again, it's up to you what you prefer to use. HTML is an understood root or home page by default. So index, the naming convention of index itself kind of gives clues to either a web server or whatever folder you're in, that is the root page. So that's just one little convention to understand, is if you name it index, it's going to be what your main website points to when it first loads, assuming you don't go to a specific path in the URL. So if you just say mywebsite.com, it's going to load this file instead of mywebsite.com/about, which would load another page. So hopefully that makes sense. We'll get into more of that as we actually code. The syntax is something to get used to. If you're not used to it, most HTML tags have, like I said, the greater than or less than signs, and then some have just an opening self-closing tag, as you can see on the green input down there on the last bullet point. Those essentially don't wrap content. So the ones that do have an ending tag that have that slash before or right after the less than sign. So on the first example there, hello world, you can see that the H3 will actually surround the text and then close itself with another H3 block. So we'll get into what each of these mean, but the hello world example there is just kind of the one that's a block element, so it's going to wrap content. The same is true for the block quote element, and those are just different tags that you can use to kind of modify what kind of content is on the page. Some of that is more or less for just semantics, so you'd see some of it renders a different way in the browser by default because there's some default styling underneath in the browser, but you can modify that with what I mentioned before called CSS, which is kind of just taking the visual element into queue. So I should define syntax is the style of the way, or the style the code is written. So every language shares similar characters in the keyboard, but they are written in different ways. So the syntax is what's different. So HTML is going to have different syntax than CSS. HTML is going to have different syntax than JavaScript. All those different syntaxes kind of make up the different language itself and what gives it its kind of characteristics. So a base HTML structure looks like this. And this is remember the syntax we were talking about. We've got the greater than and less than signs. So the main structure starts with the HTML tag. And within that, we kind of nest these other elements. And the two primary ones are going to be the head element, which kind of is responsible for rendering data that you don't necessarily see, but is responsible for describing the page or rendering certain JavaScript or CSS or SEO driven stuff. So search engine optimization. So that's stuff that kind of, when you go search for something on Google, it picks up data that comes back, and this is where it's coming from. So typically on a website, it'll have more data in between that head tag that's going to really describe what the page is about, who it's for, any other useful data that could come back in a search, or maybe if your website's linked in a tweet or in Facebook or something like that, it'll kind of render the summary of that page as a result, assuming you have that in that head tag. In between the head tag, you see a title tag. That's a way to kind of just title your page. If you ever look at the tab on your browser and see some text up there, maybe an image next to it, that's what, at least the text part, is the title. So if you're not familiar with that, that's kind of a little inside scoop there. We'll get into more detail of that. The body tag itself, anything in between there, is going to be what actually renders and is visible in the page. So you'll be able to see that, assuming you have valid HTML output into your view, and it will kind of just open up and you'll be able to render it. So if I were to open this document right now, I'd see your page heading as like a bigger heading, looking like a bolder font. Some paragraph text, which is the P tag, which is what that stands for. And then an image that's called your logo.jpg. So that would actually render an image at that point, assuming we have that in our directory or our folder where this file is. Going one step further, trying to understand block and inline elements is a little confusing. You can think of block elements as spanning the entire width of a line, or basically the full width of the browser as you see it. A block element breaks to a new line every time, and then it'll stack vertically if it's duplicated. So those examples might include these tags. One's called div, one's called h1, and one's called p, which we just talked about, the paragraph tag. And we'll get into more what each of these kind of mean and why they are what they are, but for now, I'll just kind of take it as, just an example to maybe reflect on later on. So inline elements kind of just essentially either describe and or manipulate text within block elements. So you can think of them as taking up just their own width. So only the content that the text renders will this inline element really modify or do. They won't break it to a new line, so they won't go the full width of the browser. They'll actually render inline, hence the name. And then they'll stack horizontally if duplicated. So examples might include span tags, M tags, which kind of make the text that you see italicized. And then I think that's it that I left out, but there's quite a few more we can get into as we go. Like I said, the actual code editors you can choose here depend on what your preference is, really. VS Code or Visual Studio Code is quite extendable, quite honestly daunting because there's so much you can do with it. So if you want to just download the basic version and use it without modifying anything, it's totally suitable for this little crash course. So don't worry about like customizing it unless you want to. It's up to you. Sublime Text is what I would recommend as your alternate. It's kind of got its own default look and feel, but you can customize it a lot. This is kind of more geared towards really key value configuration. So what that means is you input one thing on the left and you can assign it a value on the right, and it'll kind of tweak the editor. Whereas this is more kind of point and click. So depending on how comfortable you feel, you might want to use one or the other. I personally use Visual Studio Code, or I'll call it VS Code, just because it's kind of a basic editor that gets the job done. You don't need too much to work with it by default. So what I'm going to do to begin is create a new folder on my desktop. I'm on a Mac, so you might need to do something a little bit different, but not too much on a PC. First, create a folder just called My Resume Site. And what we're going to be building is a basic HTML resume, and it's going to have some sample articles or blog posts that we've used, and then also just a basic contact form that allows you to almost essentially have your resume hosted on a website, and then the contact form to get in touch with you. It's going to be fictitious, so it won't be like realistically usable, but you can kind of take excerpts from this course and use it on your own site if you want to. And then 3 example blog posts to kind of just give you a whole understanding of more HTML tags that we could use as we go. So with this folder created, I'm going to actually drag it into my VS Code app down here, right here. So I'll do that now. That will open it just like so. And within the folder, of course, there's nothing there yet. So what we need to first create, if you recall, is an index.html file. So I'll tap this icon here. It says a plus. You can also go to File, New File, or Command N if you're on a Mac, and just type index.html. And that's all you need to start and view an HTML file in your browser. So if we really wanted to, I'll right click here. Let's see, I can open it in Finder, and it's got a little icon to the left on my computer that signifies it's going to open in a browser, because the browser understands this code. So if I were to just double click that, it's going to open automatically. And what you see here is the actual path to that file is actually the local path to my computer. This HTML file isn't hosted on any website or anything yet, but essentially what you could do is put this on a similar service or server that's mimicking this kind of flow. So that's kind of how that works. We won't go into too much detail on hosting the website, but I will go and just show you the basics of HTML. Because my course, if you remember, I linked to that will actually walk you through creating a actual website with HTML, CSS, and then updating it, and then uploading it to a free service, which we'll use to host it, and then actually have it on a domain that either you can purchase or just have a test version of it. So check that out if you want to. So what I'll do next is go back to our code editor. And basically, to begin with HTML, you need to have some basic groundwork laid. So if you recall this slide, this is the structure we need by default. It's required. We don't need the stuff in between the body tags or the head tags per se, but we need those HTML tags, the head tag, and the body tag to start. So let's add those. We'll need one extra thing to make it a little bit valid, but it's a little more advanced. That's kind of hard to explain. But we need this doc type HTML, and that essentially says to any server that's going to render this or website that is renderable, this will set that as the doc type, and you can render your HTML this way. Typically you have an open and closing tag, so this is the basis of the page. And my code editor is kind of smart and wants to autocomplete that stuff, so you might run into that. Mine may look a little bit different than yours because I customized it, but you should be able to do similar stuff as I'm doing here. Let's scoot this over a little bit. So typically, to make a valid website, it's commonly suggested you put a lang attribute on this, and what this stands for is the default language that your website will be in. You don't need this, but you might run into some errors or hints from your code editor to say you should add this because it's useful for people visiting your website if it's hosted somewhere that they know what language it's displayed in by default. So with our HTML tags displayed, I'm going to type the head tags. Okay. And in here, we'll just put a title like we saw in the example that I had on the slide. So we'll say the resume of Jane Smith. And like I said, this will be fictitious. So we'll just start with this and kind of go down the page. So let's do the body tags next. So like I said, in the body tags is what's going to actually render what you see. But first, let's fire up the browser once more and refresh. You notice up here in my tab, I'm in Firefox, by the way. You can see that the title actually changed. So if I were to go back and say John and refresh, I'm hitting Command R in my browser to refresh. You can also click the refresh icon. So the resume of John Smith now, which is kind of what we want. Well, let's keep it at Jane because that's how I kind of have my demo. And one thing I want to do, which we won't do a ton of CSS in this tutorial because it's simply too much to cover, but what I want to do is add some bit of padding, which is kind of some cushion you can think of that goes around the whole body window. So if I type text in here and we refresh, there's a bit of margin around the left and right and top and bottom. So if I remove this, you'll see it kind of just goes up and butts up against it, which isn't very nice to look at. So that's as much CSS as I'm really going to cover, but it's more or less just some to get this looking like a realistic kind of solution. Okay, so when you start a website, typically you link to things or have a logo displayed or a title that kind of signifies, you know, what the site is about. Like we have the title tag here, but you might want to just do something that's more display oriented. So in our case, I'm going to use a tag called H1, and we have these in our arsenal. They go up to 6. So why don't I just show and tell first so you can kind of get the idea that H1 is going to be the biggest when it's displayed, and that's how that looks in the browser. And then H6 would look quite smaller. So for comparison, I'll just put 2 here from 1 to 6, and you'll see the difference. So those are it goes up scale. Now H1 is commonly the thing that Google or search engines kind of come into your website and target. So you want this to be representative of your site. You want it to be the most top level thing on your site to kind of have the best, what I called SEO earlier, search engine optimization. So if someone's searching for you or your services or whatever this is for, maybe your resume like we're doing, they'll find exactly what they're looking for if they know the name in mind or similar name. So that's just something to keep in mind. We're going to put contact information at the top. So we'll start with these P tags. And like I said, these are block level elements. Notice that they wrap content. So content comes in here. It actually breaks to a new line, which is just below the H1. So what I want to put here in particular is location. Since this is a resume, we're kind of going with that look and feel. Do like a separator there. And then next, we're going to use a tag called a tag, which has this element called href. And that's essentially saying this is going to be a hyperlink, or it's going to hyper-reference something else on another page. You can also use this to do the same for telephone numbers. So what's neat is you've passed this little attribute tel and a colon, and then you could pass the number you want to pass, and it'll actually kind of just hyper format it as a phone number. So if you were on your phone, you could actually tap this and it will actually start calling, which is kind of the neat thing about the smartphone. It would kind of pick that up and know what to do with it. So on your browser right now, if you click this, it probably wouldn't work the same way you'd hope. But on your phone, if you're there on your phone, you might want to do that. So you notice that didn't break a new line because this is a more or less an inline element. So you notice there's no breaks there as we render it out. So if we wanted to do a new line, we can add another P tag and do 2 more links. And on a resume, you might have, especially a digital version, you might have a link to your email. You could just display your email and just say janesmith@gmail.com. And that's all great. And this, if you don't pass anything, it won't actually link to anything at all. It'll just link back to the same page. So I'm clicking on it now. Nothing's happening. But if you wanted to actually link to something, you could do a mail to. In our case, that's kind of like the telephone, but this is actually going to pop up your email provider or email app that's on your actual system. So in my own system, I have this one called Spark. If that were to actually click that, that would open this in that app, and I could get a new email going real quickly instead of having to open my app, type in the email, and then kind of address it. It's kind of just a nice to have that's built into HTML. So we'll type the same email address as we have displayed here to kind of signify that. So this would actually create a new message in your default email app and allow you to really get a quick draft going. Now, the primary use case for these tags is to link to another website. So you might have Jane Smith. Maybe this is our final destination URL. So the final domain this resume would live at is this one here. So Jane Smith. It actually won't, because I doubt that domain's available for one, and we just aren't going to cover that part in this course. So what I wanted just to signify is this is the typical use case of this tag. This one's kind of one-off. So if you want to have someone contact you via email, you might throw this on your website. Same with the phone if you want someone to call you directly. All three are probably good options just for the sake of having options for the end user who sees your website. But, you know, for me, I'd prefer either email or the website itself. Okay, so going down, we've covered H1 through 6 tags, P tags, A tags, all very popular tags used in HTML. Next, I'll cover one called nav, and this doesn't actually do anything. It's just more of a way identity to explain to the browser or accessibility driven tools that this is an actual navigation that we're going to use to navigate around this particular website. So within these tags, typically you have a list. So there's a few different styles of lists you can use. Ordered, or OL, is commonly referred to ordered. I'll type it out so it's kind of clear. Or unordered. So that's the typical use case for those. We'll use an ordered list just to show you how it works. And then within that list, we have list items. So LI stands for list item. And then we can additionally add some sublinks. So these we can nest anything just like so in a navigation or whatever elements. HTML is very dynamic in that case. So you can nest all these things as you see fit. So what we're going to do here is another use case for a link is to link to an ID or a selector on a page. So I'm going to actually link to different parts of my resume that will maybe be useful for the end user who's viewing it. So in this case, I'm going to link to a skills section that's on the actual same page. And this is how that would work. So you'd pass this number sign, and then the identifier. And that'll make more sense in a second, but what we'll do, maybe just to make it clear real quick, I'll use the H2 tag. Like I said, we could do H1 through 6 and type skills as an ID attribute here. So when I click this, it'll actually find this element on the page and scroll down to it. And that's how that works. So this is that fourth use case for links. So then within the A tag, you actually need to kind of add something there. So skills summary. And we could just go down to say skills summary. And this won't really work because our page isn't long enough yet, but if it were pretty long and this were further down, it would link to that. And notice the URL updates too. We have this number sign and skills. It'll actually visit the same section on the page as a result. So that'll make more sense here in a second when I demonstrate it a little better. I'm going to copy and paste a few more here. So I'm going to put accomplishments. And then a final one will be a contact page, but we're going to actually link to another page as a result. So contact will actually link to a file in this case. So you can link to a file. It's a fifth use case. So contact.html is what you could do there. And this assumes in the same folder that that file is going to exist. So if you were to actually pass it a different folder per se. Maybe we have like contact in a subfolder. I don't know that you would, but you could pass contact to get in there and have contact.html, which is what we're actually linking to. So that might be a little confusing. So what I'm going to do is just kind of back up of that and then just move this file. I think you can drag and drop in most editors, and I'll just delete the folder above. So now we just have two at the root of our actual My Resume site folder on our desktop. So if I were to link to that real quick, you'll see what I mean. It goes to actual contact.html. There's nothing there yet because we haven't added anything. But if you go to the back button, you'll go back to the HTML site that we're starting to build. And then these are all linked into sections. If you notice, the URL is updating as we click on them. And that's all just built into HTML by default, which is very nice. Now you might be asking, well, why is work history, there's no spacing or anything like that? It's really dependent on your own preference here, how you name these. You could put a space if you want to, but it needs to match the same ID you add to your element that it's linking to. So I tend to, for IDs or signifiers like this, I tend to just remove spaces or add maybe a hyphen or an underscore. It's up to you what you want to do there. This is how I'm going to do it. It's kind of open-ended part of HTML. It's just kind of just works, which is neat. So one other tag you might see that's self-closing is called a HR tag, and that just literally means horizontal rule. So that just means adding a new line in the view. So if we add that, you'll see this line appear, and it's kind of just a separator that's built into HTML. Doesn't look that great, but it serves its purpose. So you might just need that to kind of get going with. So let's go down to a skills section, and this will be kind of just a way to identify basic skills, use some other HTML elements. So we'll say a few sentences, points, listing the most relevant hard skills and soft skills related to the position for which you are applying. We could use like actual resume data here, but I figured I'd just kind of have placeholder for you if you wanted to use it for your own. So here we've got a P tag. This can go, this text in here can span as long as you want, and then the P just needs to close at the end. So you just need to make sure you do that. One neat thing about HTML is sometimes it's very forgiving, and if you forget this, it'll kind of just do it by default. And one neat way to just kind of verify that, if you look here, we can see that the text is rendering, so it's not broken. Nothing's really wrong. But if you go and right click on the page in your browser, you might have inspect element. If you do, you can actually inspect this. It'll open this kind of DevTools console, and you can see here the P tag is actually closed. So it's quite forgiving to show you the fact that the browser is kind of smart enough to know that you might have just meant to close that. So we're going to go ahead and do it for you. Now that sometimes backfires depending on how advanced your HTML is or how nested it is, but you might find that it just saves you sometimes, which is neat. So let's go ahead and add one just because there's no way I could let that go. And then we'll add another rule, or horizontal rule, I should say. So that's kind of our summary there. Now this isn't going to look great because we aren't using CSS. I should say that up front. I believe I did. But the general idea is understanding the structure of HTML and just getting used to the syntax and the tags that you use quite often. So that's when I get it across the most. Okay, so professional accomplishments. So here we can link to that accomplishments with an ID selector. So ID is just a way to identify that element so you can actually refer to it elsewhere. So in this case, we're going to use that in this context. We're going to be able to link down to it. Now again, we can't do anything yet because the page isn't long enough, but if we were to, In fact, maybe I could shrink my browser to kind of show what I'm trying to explain. I'll wait till we have some more content because we're going to have quite a bit. But below that, we can just kind of go to town on kind of just some placeholder content again for you. Major skill 1. And then now let's use an unordered list. So it follows the same patterns as the ordered list above. So just like this, only you swap the O for the U. And this one's going to have, you can have, if you notice the ordered list, I should have said this before, it displays numbers with the periods at the end. It's kind of built into the browser and the HTML. An unordered list is going to have bullet points instead, so it won't have the numbers. So we could say more detail of the skill and how it relates to the job application. And let's do like 3 of these. I'm referring to some notes, so don't think I'm just coming up with this, of projects or situations that utilized this skill. And then we'll do the last one here. Oops. Measurable results and accomplishments that back up your ability. So we'll repeat this, but this is kind of just the high level look of the major skill, we'll say, as accomplishments, and just have different examples. So you might put management as one, something like that. But notice, like I said before, it's a bullet point at this point, which is neat. So we've got this H2 tag with the ID and then H3 following it. That's slightly smaller, and it's kind of just offset from the bottom a bit more. And then the bullet points, which is responsible from the unordered list there. So now we can kind of just repeat that section. I'll do it like so. Command C, Command V, kind of. And I'll just swap out these examples. Maybe your manager. We'll just leave it as that. It's nothing really too crazy there, but just know that that hierarchy exists. So you notice the unordered lists have some default styling, so they kind of get pushed over to the right a little bit and then have some offset on the top too. So the browser by default comes with some styles. I think I mentioned that before. You can reset those with CSS or change those up with CSS all you want, but we won't focus on that in this course. I'll do a follow-up course on CSS though. A new tag. It's called a BR tag. And this is another self-closing tag. It is possible to just write it like this in HTML5. It will understand, but you can just write it like that. I tend to just use the self-closing tag just to kind of give me the affirmation that it is what it is. What that essentially does is breaks to a new line. So if you just want to add some space in between elements, you might want to add a few of these or more than one or just one, up to you. But what we'll do is just kind of do a little bit of a hacky move to add a space before and after an HR tag, which we used prior. So now we've got some more space to work with. Okay, so next we'll get into what HTML tables are, but first I'm going to add a title called work history. So I'll add an ID, work history. And if you recall, we added that to our main navigation. So this is going to actually link to that and point to it since it's matching in the ID. So we're getting to a point where we can almost scroll down the page. You see the page jump just a little bit there. And that's kind of doing the work we wanted. So let's get some more data on the page and we'll be able to kind of really put that to use. Now tables are kind of the older fashioned way to build websites. You'll see tables in use a lot in HTML emails. Emails are kind of backwards technology that's behind in the times, but that's solely because a lot of the email Sending tools like Gmail or equivalent just aren't updated for the fact that modern HTML or CSS can be used. There's so many platforms out there that you kind of have to go back in time in terms of HTML to really render stuff in a certain way. And the old days of HTML used to be actually responsible for displaying content in a certain way, and actually rendering it more so like CSS does these days. So what I want to do is start by declaring the table element. So what the table is typically responsible for displaying a lot of data at once, and it's useful for that fact, so you kind of get that spreadsheet look. But it's also one that's kind of hard to maintain and use, and it's easy to kind of miss all the tags that are associated with it. So you'll see what I mean. But a table can actually have a caption element, kind of basically a description of the table itself. So we can just say my awesome work history. And a table is going to look like that to begin with. And we might need to do some styling on it just to make sure it's displayed a certain way. But we'll get to that. So within that element, we maintain all of the data that we're going to display. There's this T head element that's basically saying the table head. And what that is the heading elements of your table. So if you're used to Excel or something like that, you'll see at the beginning of the columns that you actually enter data into. Typically, you might want to set titles at the top or bold those, and you'll see that these are those things. So one extra detail we need is called a table row, so a TR element. And this essentially is kind of like a block level element in the fact that it spans the entire width of the table, but it essentially represents a new line of data. So you can think of it like that. And then a table heading is this element. So this is all assumed to be the heading part of the table itself. So what I'm going to put is the position of which you might have held, the company it was at, the start date, and the end date. Okay, so that gives us the groundwork, and you'll notice that we've got that in bold text. That's just by default on our table. And then this is our caption. So there's nothing that really represents what you might see in Excel so far, but you'll see what I mean as we progress here. There's a lot to cover in terms of data, but it's very repetitive. So this is the T head, and now we're getting into the T body. So this is kind of the main aspect of the table. We can reuse this TR element that represents a new row. And then the TD, or the table data, is kind of the main chunk of data you're going to really be after. So this first one here correlates with this first one here when you see it visually. So what I'll do is first put some data in and kind of talk you through it. So we're going to repeat this 4 times like we have our table head, because we're going to have the columns here associated with it. So what I'll do is just put in some companies that exist but aren't really where you worked. Maybe you did, who knows. So June 24th, I don't random years here. So this is the beginning of what your table would look like. You notice this matches the manager, which is position manager, and then company matches Apple, so that you see how it just kind of transcends down the line. So that's essentially how a table works. And what you can do if you want to add more rows is just repeat yourself like so. Each table row is going to represent new data. We can put in quite a bit there, and you'll see it just kind of goes down the line. So maybe you'd change up where you worked, of course. So we've got Apple as our first, maybe Google, and then maybe we change from 2010 to 12. Not really being realistic here, but SpaceX or something. I don't know. I don't know if it existed then, but we'll see. So we got 2 apples. That doesn't really make sense. Maybe I'll remove that one. But you get the idea. So the table rows are the rows. The table data is just representative of that cell, which is within that column or table heading. So hopefully that makes sense. It's a little tricky, I understand, to kind of grasp tables. They take a while to remember, but the more you use them, the more it makes sense. You don't see them a lot in use anymore. Sometimes, like I said, in emails, they're kind of a must, but they're used in a way that's really not representative of data. It's kind of just a way to lay out content instead. So it's kind of deceptive in that outright. So we can have a footer element too. So we've got our heading, our body, and our foot. So kind of like the human body, you can mimic it with code here as a way to metaphors to roofer footer is what I was trying to write. And then you can kind of just mock the same stuff here if you need it. This isn't very widely used, but it is something you could do if you needed to. So I'll just honestly put like dots for now. Okay. And so you get a footer below that kind of just does what it does. So you could style each of those separately with CSS as you go down the line. And that kind of ends the table element as a result. So there's more you could add. There's like table legend and whatnot, and you could do more with it. If you want to add some default width, you could say 100%, I believe, and it'll go full width. Up to you there. It kind of looks crummy. We'll just leave it at its stock version. So cool. So now we can kind of go down to work history and see how it jumps down the page doing what we want. It doesn't go all the way down to it, but if the page were long enough, the top of this would hit the top of the browser almost. Okay, so now we can actually, I'll probably copy this 3 lines. We'll just go down and we'll have that below. So that's our work history, our professional accomplishments, our skill summary so far. Now we can get to our education. So I'll do the same thing, just kind of using the same h2 tag and then education for the hyperlink. And in this area, I'm going to use a details and summary HTML elements. And what these are great for is kind of a built-in accordion-like user experience. So if you've ever clicked on something and it toggles open and closed, that's kind of what an accordion is. So it's like an actual instrument accordion. Is where it gets its name. So a details element is going to be what surrounds the whole block of content. And this is a block level element. We wrap content within it. And then in that, we'll have a summary element. So there's 2 elements that kind of play this role. And what I'll do is kind of just show you, we'll have an M element. Again, this makes it italicized. So we'll just name each degree or education here, and then we could just say a strong tag will kind of make it bold. So Harvard University, and then 2008. So that gets us to this state. Notice this is all built in, so we didn't have to code or add any of this arrow functionality. And clicking on this, you notice the little dotted line around it. That's just saying it's active in my particular browser. Your browser might make that look different. I think in Chrome it might be like a blue outline or something like that. Firefox does it a little bit differently. But this is the M tag right there. Notice it's kind of italicized. The strong tag makes this bold. And then our year is just basically the default state of HTML content. Now, this is actually more useful when you add content outside of the summary, but still within the details element. So what I'll do in my code editor, I can type lorem and then hit tab, and it actually outputs. Feel free to use any text you want. If you want to pause and go find some, you can. It really doesn't matter how much you use here, just some. I'll just duplicate a couple lines. The key thing here is to just show you that this isn't displayed by default because this is collapsed. So if we click on this, you'll see that content at that point, which is kind of neat. So you get that built in using the details and summary. So we can kind of do that once more, maybe to have two. And I'll show you why. I think I spelled that wrong. Pardon me for any spelling errors. Kind of going fast. We'll say high school diploma. Harvard High School here, maybe 2005 or whatever. Just an idea. And the reason I wanted to do two is because I want to have this little bit of addition of open to this tag at the top, the details tag. And what that's going to signify is to say that that first one's going to be open by default instead of just closed like that, which is kind of neat. Okay, so we'll do one more copy of this to get the blog section. And we can do h2 id equals blog. And the blog we can do kind of a similar way of displaying our table, but I'll show you how it's used to kind of manipulate layout a bit. This is where using it in emails might make more sense. So we'll kind of go down. You can not have the table body if you don't want. HTML is smart enough to still render it a certain way. Those tags are just useful for being descriptive and semantic. What we'll start with is this tag called article, which signifies that it's an actual article. So a blog article, for instance, we can add. And I'll put some styling here because it's going to look pretty bad otherwise. So we'll say padding 10 pixels, border 1 pixel, solid black. And I won't go too deep in what that really means because that's just CSS. I'll have another course with that. Within an article, you can have a header tag. Header kind of represents the title element or the top level element of the surrounding tag. And it's a good way to get just article-based stuff rendered within HTML. And these are newer tags to the HTML5. So there's stuff that wasn't really around in the old days. But within this, you typically have a heading of some sort. So we'll say latest blog post title. And then you can add maybe a date or something. October 31st, 2020, Halloween. And then within the article below the header, you can have the actual content. So lorem ipsum is again, and again, I hit lorem, I typed lorem, the word lorem, and hit tab in my code editor, and it kind of just worked. Yours might not. Now within here, we can add an A tag to kind of just signify, let's go to another page. That's going to be the blog post itself, because this is just essentially an excerpt of the blog post. So we have blog post 1. So we could just say continue. And we'll need to create that file. So we could say blog post 1 HTML. And I'll probably create 3 files. So blog post 2 HTML, blog post 3.html. And we'll come back to these. I just wanted to make them for now so we can actually link to them and visit them. Great, so now what we'll do is copy this entire block with the TD tags and just repeat it 2 more times. So they're touching here, you see, we could put spaces if it helps. But this is essentially how this would work. And then we'll just link to different 3 there, 2 there, and then 1 on the first one. And then we could say title 2. And title 3. So that gives us this look based on the table layout that we added and then the articles within. So that's kind of a neat trick you can use tables for if you need to. That doesn't necessarily involve CSS. We can add what's known as a footer element too. We've added our header here, and a footer element can exist either within the context of this article or another section or div or something, and then also be an actual footer itself. So if you were to add it in the global space of the HTML document, so right before the ending body tag, that's going to signify that it's the footer of the whole web page. We could put copyright, and then you could use these short codes to kind of signify the copyright symbol. There's a whole list of these. If you Google those, they kind of just have HTML symbols, I think they're called. They'd allow you to type that out and render actual glyphs or pictographs of things that are built into the code as well. So within the footer, typically you have like an address or links to your other resources on the site or whatever you want to do. In this case, I'm just going to put an address, and there's an actual address element that's useful for search engines and mobile devices and the like. So we'll add that, and then 98101. Then I'll show you what that looks like just as a result. It's kind of italicized just by its own default. And notice that copyright symbol is what essentially this is on the front, on the back side of the code, but it renders that way, which is kind of neat. There's a whole list of those, like I said, so you can Google those and figure out all the other ones that you might want to add. So if we were to actually click these pages, you notice it points to blog post 1.html, blog post 2.html, and blog post 3. So that makes sense. Now on like a real website with kind of some scripting on the back end, those links might be generated dynamically. It might not be something that you have to create by hand each time, but it is something to think about. So at this point, we've reached the end of this web page, but we want to still have a contact form, which we created earlier, and then kind of round out our blog posts. Now, when you create a new HTML page, you still need that same structure in each one of them. What I'll do is kind of follow suit of our main page here, at least the top portion. So right here, from the nav up, I'll copy and paste that into blog post 1. And then we need to make sure we close the body tag and the HTML tag as a result. So now that page is going to have at least our navigation already to go. And we honestly need to do this for each blog post. So I'll copy and paste that into each one, and we'll come back and just kind of modify those as we see fit. So blog post 1, you'd probably want to just change the title of this page to match that page. So blog post 1. And if we were to open it, notice the next page we're on is the resume of Jane Smith. And if we click through, we can get to blog post 1. Notice the title changes. And we'll probably do the same on the H1. Just to match, that helps with search engines. So blog post 1. And we probably don't need the contact information, but more so just the navigation. So let's leave that on the other page. So maybe I'll actually copy it now on blog post 2 just to get that. So all we need to change then is that and that. This is on the page 3. One hiccup with this copy and pasting this is that when if we were to link to this, there's no actually number sign skills on this page. There will not be one. So what we can do in that general concept is go back to the blog post page and essentially link to the file itself and then append that to the end. And that's going to allow us to kind of link to the file and then go link to the section on that page. So in this case, our index page will link to that. So I should have probably copied these. I'll just paste those accordingly on each one. So that's going to allow us to go to blog post 1 page, but go back to the index page if we clicked on that. And that's how that works. You still need to pass that path to that main file first for those tags to work when you click on them. Otherwise, you go down to the page, you'll see it works on this page, but if you go to the blog post education, it works the same way now since we added that index.html path to it. So hopefully that's clear. Now what we've added before, pretty much been all HTML that doesn't really render any media, but you can add images the same way. So image tag is actually an inline element, so it basically doesn't wrap content. but it has all these attributes you can add that allow it to do as such. So we want to render an image. I'm going to use a resource that's called Unsplash, and it just kind of is a great place to find open source image. But this is actually a link to random images for testing purposes. So unsplash.com/random will allow us to display a random image on that first page. So if on blog post 1, I can render an image and it's just showing a random one each, pretty much almost every page load, which is kind of neat. Notice it's huge though, so we might want to pass some parameters to kind of make it set width and height. So maybe width would be, you just pass this quoted figure there, or whatever you prefer. We'll make it just a square, so 700 by 700. This would be pixels. Again, we'll get into more of that with CSS. That's more of the terminology over there. But each time you refresh, it kind of just every few refreshes it regenerates, which is neat. Commonly on images, you want to think about people who visit the website who might have vision impairments. So it's commonly referred to as accessibility. And there's a tag called alt tag. It's kind of an alternative way to describe the image. What you can do is pass some descriptive text of what the image is, and it would, I can't normally do this because this is a random image. I don't really know what's coming, but if you did know what was there, you could describe it in such a way. Just pass some text through to describe exactly what the image is, or at least a general idea. So you notice before it renders, that will actually display. This is commonly a nice thing to have too, in case there's a long wait time for the web page to load. So that's going to be like the blog post feature image. Again, it's fictitious, so it's just random at this point, but we can add our article on this page now, which signifies what the blog post is. And then we can have our heading if we want to repeat the heading. So lorem ipsum. Then we could just add some more blocks of text. I'm going to do the same thing with p tags. In the slides, I had a tag called block quote, and that's essentially a way to kind of pass a quote that someone said to the HTML. So we'll do something like that. And maybe we'll pass some quotation marks. And then some more p tags. Okay, and then we can close that one down and pass in our footer now too. We can copy that from the index. All right, so here's each of our articles. Notice they're not very long because they're not wrapping lines, but we've got this set up to where it would kind of look and feel the way we would prefer for an article of this sort. If you add CSS in the picture, this could look a lot nicer. So keep that in mind. But right here, notice that's the actual block quote. That's the one we put quotations around. It comes with some default styling that offsets it as an actual quotation, as opposed to just basic paragraph tags. So maybe in our second blog post, we do a little bit different, and I'll copy a lot of what one is, honestly, and just update some of this stuff over. So blog post 2, post 2. And maybe instead of a block quote, we can add, there's a figure element. So figure is another way to render an image if you wanted. You pass it around, essentially around an image element, and it allows you to add like a fig caption. So this is my caption. So for each image you would have, we need to go blog post 2. So I'll go back to the blog. So right below is the caption, there is the fig caption, and then the image itself. It's a little skewed because we're trying to render a horizontal image as a square, but you get the idea. But notice the captions there are same articles below. Each of our paragraph tags kind of coincide there. If you wanted to set like a width on this, you could, like width, maybe, I don't know, 900 pixels, just to give you some idea of like what CSS is capable of. And then again, this isn't the CSS course, but it's kind of nice to get an idea of what could be. This will kind of shift it to the center. with margin, 0 auto, like up and bottom is that, and then this is left and right. But again, we won't go too deep. But that's just a general idea. I'll probably, for consistency's sake, just take that off. And then we can go and copy this, and we'll go into the third and final blog post. Update the titles. And what did we do different here? Nothing too different here, kind of the same stuff. So just to have blog post 3 and the scope of things too. So there we go. So last but not least will be our contact page, and this will have what is basically most of the form elements in a typical HTML document that you're probably going to use. There's a lot under the hood that you might use, might not use so much, but I just want to give you the basics so you can understand it. So let's start there. We're going to start again with our main heading. So we'll kind of borrow from our index page here and kind of copy this over. There we go. There's our basic stuff. Let's get our footer while we're at it. I know we'll need that. Great. Okay, so we probably don't need, again, our contact information so much. Yeah, maybe we do. Let's leave it there since it is a contact page, right? So let's keep that. Let's add the index HTML to each of these. Again, this is so it visits that page and then links to that section on the page, or that anchor is what they commonly call. There we go. And then now we can get into kind of what form elements might be. So typically on a website, you're probably going to run into a page where you enter some data, and that's what we call form elements or forms on HTML pages. So we could say contact me using the form below, and we'll say form. It's going to have a default action. So action means the page it's going to send this data to. So anything you input in this form kind of gets bundled into a language the server or wherever your app's hosted or website is hosted can speak. And it kind of just absorbs that data and it lets you kind of take it in and do things with it, either store it in some database somewhere, like as a place to just have, kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. You could think of it a database like that, or just something similar where it just submits it to some service and kind of manipulates it from there. So that's what forms are responsible for, taking input from the user. So typically there'd be some sort of URL here. So we could say URL to process form, maybe it's PHP. So that's just fictitious. That won't actually do anything. But if you were to click it, it would actually kind of go to that path and try to submit the data. Now within a form element, there's a lot you can have, and we'll get into just the basics you might use. There's a lot you could potentially use elsewhere too. So let's start with the basics. A field set is a way to kind of divide the sets of fields that you're using into one group. So you can think of it as a grouping mechanism. Within a field set, you might have a legend. There's just kind of a signifier to display what this group is. If I can spell legend. So this could be personal information, for instance. And then below that, you'd have this group of inputs. So a label is going to basically be a control for the input below. So a default input type that you'll see a lot is called type text. This is essentially just a text input. So you can type data into it and be on your way. So commonly, maybe a service asks for your name. So you'll notice this for element or attribute. And what we can do is put full name here. And it's actually going to be a way to connect the dots to this full name here. So kind of like we've done in these scenarios with the number sign and then the identifier, we're kind of doing that here, only this isn't anything to click on per se so much. but it is a way to make your form elements like tabbable, so you can use your tab key to go through them and just more accessible to pretty much anyone. So we'll say full name. And then a neat thing in this type of input, again, this is a self-closing tag, so we can add that self-closing slash at the end. You don't need that in HTML5, but it's nice to just signify that that is an inline element and it won't be any block-based element that's going to surround content. You can add a placeholder for each form element. So input fields in particular could have like a full name input. So we can just take a look and see how that looks so far. So notice the placeholders there. That goes away when I start typing, which is nice. But we have the label. Notice when I click on it, it actually highlights this field. And that's because we added that for attribute. If we took that off, notice what happens if I click on that now, nothing's going to happen. So that's kind of a nice to have, and honestly should be there when you're adding form elements. So that's text input. Now let's add one that's called input type email. I'll add some BR tags to kind of shift things down, but we'll add one called email now. And we could pass the ID email. And what I tend to do is make these two match. And this is how they kind of connect. You have a for, and that maps to the ID. So if you make those match, you should be in shape. And again, we can do the placeholder here. I could say John Doe at example.com. There we go. You notice it's there. If I click on this again, it highlights it, which is great. And then we could just say, my name's Andy at webcrunch.com. So something like that works all the same. And we can do the same for phone number. There's a specific type for that. You can just say tel, which stands for telephone. So we'll do the same there and then modify this to say telephone. And you could add a placeholder here if you want. We'll just put, this is not my number if you couldn't guess. But there we go. We want to probably break new lines so these aren't displayed inline. So I'll kind of duplicate that just so they break down vertically. You wouldn't probably ask for this because it maybe would be rude, but I put an age input that's essentially just another use case for another input. But we could say age here, and the type is called number. And the neat thing about this is you can have a placeholder like we did before, but you can set minimum and maximum amounts. So I'll just say maybe 32 is your default age. I don't know why, but you have to have minimum of 18, for instance. And you could still submit the form, but it would be red if you put something, or it would kind of notify you that it wouldn't be valid if you put something less than 16. See, my browser knows by default that that isn't valid because we set that minimum, but if we set 19, it's fine. So that's kind of a nice thing to know. Finally, there is a date input, which allows you to use a built-in date picker to pick a date that you might want to maybe schedule a meeting or something like that. It's a little limiting, but it is one that works. So if you need just something out of the box, we could go and use this. So date, and we'll say date for the type. And this one's a little bit more complex. There's no placeholder per se, but we could just say the name, we can say is current date. And then a value will have, by default, will be, it needs to be in this format. So this is this current year, and you do the month and then the day. So then we could set, like we did on the number, a minimum if you want. You don't have to set this. And a max. That gives you this to start with, and depending on your browser it might look different, but this date picker shows itself, and you can actually clear it if you click that X sign or add one at will. So it's November as I'm recording this. And we can actually end the field set there. So if we add another field set, we can get more different, we can kind of just group it as different data that's coming through. And that's mostly useful for when you add data, cohort of data in a sense. So we could say reason for contact. And what we'll get into now is a new element called a select field. So we could say label for reason, and we'll say select a reason, and then select field. By default, my editor wants me to have a name. You can add one. You don't necessarily need a name for it or an ID, but I will put an ID for the sake of our label above. Within a select field, there are option fields. So these fields are the options you choose when you click a select. So if you're not sure what a select is, it's this kind of drop down looking thing that renders normally in some browsers. It might look a little different on your browser, but that's what it is. And a value is going to be what actually gets submitted to your server or your website, wherever you're hosting your website. This text in between here is what's actually displaying to the user. So you can format this a little bit differently if you want, but it displays that way because that's what's actually rendering. Now you can have as many options as you want. Typically the values would be unique. So, and then for jokes, I'd like to try to sell you something, which is typically why people contact you, right? So I'll just copy this over. Okay, so now we've got these options rendering in the select field. Notice that the longest one's going to span the full width of this thing. So you could, again, modify that with CSS if you want to not be so long, or just kind of tweak the naming conventions you use there. And then finally, the message details. We can have a field set for that. So we'll say legend. Message details. We'll have a label for the message and a text area, which is going to be another input field, but it's like the bigger inputs you see. So by default, my editor assumes I'm going to have these things. I'm going to just add the message for now. Calls and rows allow you to kind of resize it with HTML alone. Typically, I would use CSS, but you could manipulate this to be a lot bigger. So calls would span it with more wide like so, and then rows could be smaller in that regard. So something like that. So we'll leave that as is, just to kind of use it. But you can, again, like the other fields, have a placeholder. So this allows you to just have some default content before the user enters their message. So something like that. So there's the default. You can just start typing and it'll go away. And then if you remove the text, it'll come back. Now the text area isn't a self-closing tag based element, so you'd actually need that closing tag for this. In the past, you were able to add default content here and it would display in the field, but that isn't the case so much anymore. So another field set would be the communication preferences. So maybe a group of, if you've seen these toggle switches or something in other websites, these are those controls that allow you to kind of do pick and choose from pre-selected options. And what that looks like is this, and this is how you would actually write it, which is neat. The label itself in this case would surround the input, and the input would be a type of radio. And radio is just a way to say that it's like this little circular thing. I'll show you by example here, but we can say name would be preference, and name's going to play a big role here as opposed to other elements. But we could say value is email, and we'll say email. And this is how that looks at this point. So that's the actual input radio look and feel. But what we can do, you wouldn't actually do what I just did here. You would close that off and just have that text on the other end. And then it's all set. So when you click on the text itself, it actually functions as almost like a button because you're surrounding the label around the input. So you're able to do that way instead of doing the 4-bit, passing an ID there. You can do it this way as well. So instead of, like I said, this and displaying them 2 different lines, you can actually wrap the input in a similar way and get the same job done. Like I said, the name matters here because this is considered the group of radio elements or inputs. And why that matters is because if you didn't put that name and you just put like pre or whatever, these don't really coincide. So you can select all of them at once if you wanted, which doesn't make much sense. You want to only allow the user to select specific one at a time. So when they all have the same name, you notice it toggles on and off as you scroll through each. So instead of email, maybe we'll do phone here. And then for funnies, Morse code, just to be funny. So there's the third one. Now when we reload the page, it's gonna just assume based on your history of it that you're gonna have the first one selected. If you want to have a default one selected, you can add this attribute called checked. So maybe you want to have phone by default. Let's go back to contact. Yeah, there we go. So when you visit the page, it'll actually take that setting, not just refresh it. Finally, there's a few more fields that you might use, you might not. These are just other ones that are kind of neat, honestly. So field set, we can say documents and color, legend, excuse me. So we could say document. So one thing, you probably will use this one a lot, is called file. So we could say upload a file, which you always do all the time, probably on a lot of websites, depending on what you need to do. The same rule applies. You just pass the type file, and then we'll pass ID file here just to make the label coincide with the element. And that just gives you this default look and feel. When you click it, you go to the same file. You can attach our actual index file here as an example, and it works all the same. And that data can be passed through the form accordingly. One thing with that though, when you do pass files, you need to add a multi-part true function, and this just allows you to basically pass file data through the form instead of just text, and it just allows that actually to work, because by default HTML wants to kind of make things secure in that regard, so you kind of need to append that to the form. It's kind of an advanced topic, but that's just one thing to take into account if you're going to actually pass a file field down through a form. So finally we have one for color. And then the same thing applies here, input. And what I'm doing there, I have this extension called emit. You can go to this tab here, search for emit. And I think I already have it installed on my machine, but basically just autocomplete stuff as you type it. And it's just a nice tool to have. So when I type input and I hit tab, it'll actually complete that for me. It's just a kind of a lazy hack, but you can just type input, type color all the same, and get the same results. I figured I should mention that in case you saw that and was wondering how I typed it so fast. Color, we need an ID of color just to coincide again with the label, and that gives us this UI or user interface to work with. And you can click that and just choose based on your system. It'll pull up the native color picker in your computer. For Mac, it looks like this little panel with all these different options you can choose for colors. So as a final, maybe we'll do the BR just to offset a little bit of space to the footer, and that's kind of completes our form. So if we go back to contact, we can visit that page and just set things up from there. We go back to our skills summary on the index page and go to town. One neat thing you could do just to kind of have a link always back to your root path is on the add another index or anchor tag, I should say, to your Jane Smith heading here. And actually it should probably wrap the heading. Fix this up real quick. So the concept in mind here is if you have a root path on your site that you always want to go back to, it's going to default here would normally be just index.html is the safe bet to link to. But sometimes you can just get away with just using the path. So in this case, if you just do the /, that's going to automatically link back to the beginning. So I'm going to update this in all of our documents. But index and contact will be the ones where we can link back to the root path. And this is actually based on my browser. It's going to go back to that. So we actually realistically need our index file there. So I told you wrong. It would actually still need to go to that file. And we'll update that as a result. So now it'll still come back to this root path, which is kind of a common convention. When you see a logo on a website, it links back to the main website homepage. That's just kind of a convention that's been upheld in web design for a while. I believe that wraps things up. We've got our main resume index page that we've used a ton of HTML elements, everything from heading tags to table tags, link tags, unordered lists, and beyond. I hope you've learned something in this. I know we've gone pretty fast for the time that it's taken, but this is a very crash course based course. If you want to go way more in depth, I do have my own course coming out soon at the time of this recording called hellohtmlcss.com. So you can head to that website and learn more about that. Right now it's still being built, but I have a sign up form that you can get notified on that if you enter your email, I'll be able to notify you as soon as it's live so you can get access to it. So I hope you check that out. I hope this was useful again. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments below. All right, thanks so much. Hello HTML and CSS is my new course on HTML and CSS. So visit hellohtmlcss.com to learn more.